Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Chris Cillizza, political commentator and senior advisor with DGA Group. Chris, thanks so much for coming on.
Good to see you as always.
It is great to see you, especially at this time, because as we sit here right now, we are in the very final days of the Biden presidency. And I would love if we could, before Trump's inaugurated on Monday, if we can reflect on the past 4 years of President Biden. So first, to start off the conversation, how do you think the history books are going to remember Biden?
Yeah, I mean, Brittany, one thing that's hard is history isn't written right after a presidency. We've seen this with presidents from Ulysses S. Grant to George H.W. Bush to George W. Bush, which is how you're perceived when you leave right after you leave office versus how you're perceived 10, 50, 100 years later can be very different. And usually, honestly, it's more positive as time passes. I think that may well be true for Joe Biden, at least in part because he leaves office extremely unpopular. There's really nowhere to go but up. He's in the mid-30s in terms of job approval. I think most people think that this was not a successful presidency. Now, Biden's argument, which he made in a farewell address he gave from the Oval Office, which he and his aides will continue to make both in these final days as well as after he leaves the presidency, is I did a lot of things I didn't get enough credit for, and over the long run, you'll see that. That could be the infrastructure spending that he okayed, $1.2 trillion worth, the CHIPS and Science Act, some of these things that are going to spend a huge amount of money and could well be looked back on and say, oh, Joe Biden did do that thing. He just didn't get that much credit for it. So I do think he will probably be, in 10 years, my guess is Joe Biden's numbers are better than Joe Biden's numbers today. But where he ranks historically, I think, is hard to say. What I can tell you is today, most people, and by that I just mean a majority of the public, think this was a failed presidency. 61% of people in the recent CNN poll out earlier this week said his presidency was more a failure than a success.
I think that's a really interesting point you bring up, that people remember presidents more with rose-colored glasses. And I think that was on full display at President Jimmy Carter's funeral when you see President George W. Bush, who in the immediate aftermath of his presidency was credited for both the war and the recession. He gave Obama a friendly belly tap, and that moment went viral. Everyone saying, oh, look how cute George W. Bush is, when, that wasn't really the case 20 years ago.
Oh, my gosh. I mean, I remember distinctly liberal friends of mine saying George W. Bush was the devil. Now when I talk to them, they're like, oh, he's great, he's painting pictures, and you know what I mean? Like, yes, we do tend, human nature being what it is, we tend to remember the good stuff rather than the bad stuff.
But what specific stuff, when you look at his record specifically, do you think will go down and people will remember? Because this is what he said in an exit interview with USA Today. I hope that history says that I came in and I had a plan how to restore the economy and reestablish America's leadership in the world. And he added this, and I hope it records that I did it with honesty and integrity, that I said what was on my mind. Do you think in 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, that's how we're going to remember Joe Biden?
So I think that's how Joe Biden would like us to remember him. I think the two biggest that definitely will be remembered about Joe Biden were, number one, he beat Donald Trump and he led the country out of COVID. Now, any president who was elected would have led the country out of COVID in some way, shape, or form because the pandemic eventually receded during their term. But I think that's piece two that will be remembered no matter what is, this is a guy who stayed in the race too long, who was too old to seek a second term, who had what I would say is the worst debate performance in modern American presidential history, who was forced out of the race, and whose chosen successor or heir to the Biden throne, Kamala Harris, lost to Donald Trump. So Biden's legacy is bookended by Donald Trump, right? He ran to be the guy who was going to rid the country of Donald Trump. Seemingly he did it, but it was only an interregnum because Donald Trump came back around. So it's sort of like, I don't think you would talk about Joe Biden's legacy without talking about Donald Trump and his role in American politics.
I think that's a really interesting point, because when you start the conversation with, in 2020, Biden beat Trump, you really can't let go of the caveat, but then he had to drop out of the race because there was talk about his cognitive state, and then
Yep.
Trump ended up coming in again. Do you think that President Biden's legacy is dependent on what happens in Donald Trump's next term as well?
Yeah, I think that's an astute question, and I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, history would tell us that all of these presidents are compared to one another over time, right? Lincoln's greatness was somewhat apparent in the moment, but even more apparent by the people who preceded and succeeded him, who did not have the success that he had in moving the country away from slavery. So, yes, is the answer as it relates to Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I think, like it or not, Joe Biden is in a permanent historical relationship with Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is seen to be, as he was by the end of his first term, by a majority of the public to have sort of failed the job, to not be up to the job, Joe Biden will look better. Some of the things Joe Biden warned about democracy, and that Donald Trump was more focused on himself than the good of the country. If the country perceives those things to wind up being true by the end of Donald Trump's next 4 years, I do think Biden will benefit. If Donald Trump leads an economic resurgence, and yes, he's unorthodox, but he gets things done and he reshapes sort of the U.S. allies in the world, then Biden may look worse. But I don't think there's any question that how the next 4 years goes has a huge impact on how we think of Joe Biden historically.
From the June debate with Biden and Trump to when he ended up dropping out in July, there was this knife fight on display and behind closed doors in the Democratic Party of Nancy Pelosi reportedly leading the charge to get him out to clear the way for a successor there. And Joe Biden, First Lady Joe Biden, she discussed this this past week. She said she was disappointed with Pelosi and said in an interview that, hey, we were friends for 50 years. Essentially, this hurt my feelings. What do you think of the intra-Democratic fighting that's happening now in the party that's been on display since the summer and going on to Trump's second term?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not surprising, right? The notion that Democrats tried to sell after July 21st, when Joe Biden got out of the race, was, oh, he's just doing it for the good of the country, and he really wants to do this. He, of course, didn't want to do it. We know that. 2 days before he got out of the race, he said only, and I'm quoting him here, the Lord Almighty could convince him to get out of the race. So we knew there was bad blood. Joe Biden's reaction, I think, is at some level understandable. It's the reaction of a spouse, not a political operative. But I do think, look, there's a lot of blame to go around here. I mean, Donald Trump has 4 more years in office, and not just that. Republicans control the Senate. Republicans control the House. Republicans control the majority of state legislatures and governorships in the country. So, I think that anytime you lose, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing. And I think what Democrats have to do in the next year or two is say, okay, the Democratic brand is not working currently. Let's put aside sort of who's to blame for what's happened up till now. We have to figure out from now going forward, what are we going to talk about it? How are we going to talk about it? What kind of voices are we going to put forward? What kind of people are we going to put forward to try to sort of reverse this losing streak?
And I guess to that point then, aside from the blame game, aside from the finger pointing, because everyone says the blame could be on the far right or far left to President Biden himself and everyone in between, what do you think? Do you think that the Democrats are going through an identity crisis, and how do you think they're going to come out on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, look, anytime you lose a national election, there is a lot of navel gazing. It's just the nature of the beast. If Republicans had lost, there'd be a lot of navel gazing about, did they make a wrong bet on Donald Trump? I do think that the Democratic Party has to be something more than just not Trump or anti-Trump or never Trump. I think that there's lots of people who are not Democratic base voters who are like, yeah, I don't love the guy, but what do Democrats stand for? And the answer for a lot of people is sort of this woke, trans, identity politics stuff that they don't like. And so, I do think Democrats have to figure out a way. This is not just about Donald Trump. If they continue to make it just about being the opposition to Donald Trump, I think they'll wind up coming up short again. The only thing I will say, Brittany, is history would suggest that the midterm 2026, the midterm election should be good for Democrats. Republicans control everything. So basically the only thing they can do is either hold their ground or lose it a little bit. And history would suggest that midterm should be good for the party that is not in control of the White House. So maybe the sort of tides of elections fix this problem a little bit for Democrats. Even if they do well in 2026, though, I would not assume that problem is solved. To me, the next really big test of the Democratic brand is 2028.
I do, before I let you go, want to look ahead at Donald Trump's second term here. We saw some key Senate confirmation hearings this past week. People like Pam Bondi for AG, Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, and Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary. What stood out to you this past week when you're looking at key moments from these hearings?
Yeah, I think Hegseth is the one. I mean, look, I thought that Pam Bondi was going to get confirmed as Attorney General before her confirmation hearing, and I think she is going to after it. Same thing with Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. To me, Hegseth was the one where there was like some level of uncertainty. What became clear pretty quickly, though, in that confirmation hearing was that Republicans were going to defend him, up to and including Joni Ernst, the senator from Iowa, that we thought might be a swing vote, and that she was going to be for Hegseth. So, look, Pete Hegseth, a month and a half ago, I would have bet you Pete Hegseth wouldn't make it as defense secretary. I think he now has a better than 90% chance of making it. That, to me, out of this week of confirmation hearings, was the sort of the biggest takeaway.
Matt Gaetz, who was the AG nominee before Pam Bondi dropped out after a House ethics report was going to release some really gnarly accusations about his character. Pete Hegseth has faced a fury of allegations, including sexual abuse, financial mismanagement, and drunken and inappropriate conduct around colleagues.
Yep.
Do you think that this suggests the fact that it's looking like he's going to get confirmed, that integrity, past behavior doesn't matter as much anymore?
It's a good question, and I think you can't have that conversation without talking about Donald Trump and his the credible accusations and allegations against him regarding women, his case with E. Jean Carroll. So do I think that standard has changed? I do. Do I think that Pete Hegseth benefited from the fact that a lot of the negative stories you just went through happened before Christmas and kind of amazingly in this news cycle now feel like old news? I do. If all of those stories you just detailed happened a week before hearing, I think he'd be in a lot more trouble. Recency bias is a real thing for senators, members of the media, and everybody else. I think he benefited from the fact that it was kind of, oh, well, we already know about that. It's like, well, we didn't know about it December 1st, but I think that's probably would help them. And again, I do think there is sort of how he behaves in private doesn't affect what he's going to do as defense secretary, which is the same logic lots of people use to vote for Donald Trump.
Chris, before I let you go, is there anything that you saw in these hearings over the past week that gives an insight or any indication of what the second Trump term is going to look like?
Yeah, I was again, the Hegseth one was the one I paid the most attention to, and I was struck by how aggressive Democrats, from Tim Kaine to Elizabeth Warren to Mazie Hirono, were going at Hegseth on some of this personal stuff. Because I do think there's a calculation that Democrats are going to have to make it. Are they going to just resist Trump and Trump's nominees no matter what, under all circumstances, over this next 4 years? Or are they going to try to find ways to work with some of them? And at least the initial readout was when it came to Pete Hegseth, they are going to be in attack mode. There is not going to be any conciliation. And I take that as a data point. I don't think it's conclusive. But I did think that was interesting. As we sort of head to, there's so much focus on what Trump is going to do. How Democrats react to what Trump is going to do is a big story too.
And as we head into what Trump is going to do in his second term, I hope you come back on and join me. Chris Cillizza, thank you so much for the conversation. I appreciate it every time.